Hey everyone, welcome back to Medieval Historian. Today, we're diving into one of the strangest and most unsettling aspects of the past, medieval beauty standards. This video is all about the bizarre, dangerous, and deeply controlling rules that women were expected to follow just to be considered beautiful. From bleaching their skin with toxic substances to plucking out their eyebrows and even their hairlines, the expectations weren't just strange, they were painful, deadly, and enforced by class, religion, and superstition. Now think about how we approach beauty today. We've got makeup tutorials, filters, skincare routines, and the freedom to express ourselves however we want, or not at all. We talk about self-love, body positivity, and individuality. But centuries ago, beauty was not about self-expression. It was about obedience. A woman's looks could decide her future, her marriage, her safety, even her survival. There was no choice. There were only rules, and they were as bizarre as they were brutal. So, before we begin and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. You guys make this journey even more amazing. This is the bizarre beauty rules women faced in medieval times. In the medieval world, beauty was not a personal choice. It was a social demand with very real consequences. A woman's appearance wasn't just about attraction, it was about morality, class, obedience, and control. If she fit the mold of what was considered beautiful, she was seen as virtuous, desirable, and even blessed by God. If she didn't, she could be mocked, marginalized, or viewed with suspicion. Beauty in this time wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon, a burden, and a survival strategy all at once. From a young age, girls were introduced to the unspoken rules. Pale skin meant purity and nobility. A high, rounded forehead showed refinement. Thin, arched brows, or none at all, signaled self-discipline and status. Every feature on a woman's body was judged through a lens of superstition and hierarchy. Her looks could dictate whether she married well or not at all. They could determine how she was treated in the marketplace, in church, or even by her own family. The expectation to conform was relentless, and the price for failure was high. There was no room for natural aging, no space for individuality. Beauty standards weren't just harsh, they were deliberately unattainable. The suffering that came with trying to meet those ideals was often considered noble. Pain wasn't just tolerated, it was part of the process. Women endured physical discomfort, humiliation, and sometimes permanent injury just to be seen as acceptable. It didn't matter how intelligent or capable a woman was. If her appearance didn't meet the standard, her worth was questioned. And yet, through this impossible maze, women found ways to adapt, to endure, and sometimes to resist. They created rituals, passed down knowledge in whispers, and crafted subtle forms of self-expression that spoke louder than they were allowed to. The price of beauty was steep, but women paid it not because they believed in the rules, but because the world gave them no choice. To understand the beauty rules of the Middle Ages, we have to first understand the image of the ideal woman. She was pale, demure, small in stature, and deeply silent. Her face was smooth and light, untouched by the sun or labor. Her forehead stretched high and wide, so wide, in fact, that many women plucked or shaved their hairlines to achieve the look. Her eyebrows were either pencil-thin or removed entirely, and her lips were kept small and tinted just enough to appear delicate and healthy. This ideal was shaped not by the desires of women, but by the expectations of men, clergy, and nobility. In many ways, the perfect medieval woman was designed to look like a painting, still, decorative, and controllable. Her beauty wasn't supposed to be seductive. It was supposed to be passive. She was a canvas onto which male fantasies, religious ideals, and social status were projected. Skin tone played a massive role. Tanned skin meant labor, and labor meant poverty. So the ideal woman stayed indoors, cloaked in shade, her skin protected from even the faintest hint of sun. A pale complexion didn't just signify wealth, it signified that a woman was untouched, both physically and socially. Thinness, frailty, and softness were praised because they implied that a woman didn't need to work for her survival. But this perfection was entirely artificial. It was built through plucking, painting, scraping, and sometimes scarring. Women would apply powdered lead to lighten their faces, risking illness or death in the process. They'd use herbs to redden their cheeks, waxes to remove body hair, and tinctures to soften their skin. All of this effort was expected to remain invisible, too. A woman could beautify herself, but only in secret. To be caught trying was to be accused of vanity or deceit. And perhaps most importantly, the ideal was not static. It shifted subtly based on region, religion, and era. What didn't change was the pressure. Whether in the courts of France or the villages of England, women were held to impossible standards that served to keep them silent, compliant, and always striving. The ideal woman wasn't real. But millions of real women suffered trying to become her. In the medieval imagination, the paler a woman's skin, the purer her soul, or so they claimed. Pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was deeply symbolic. It represented chastity, nobility, and moral superiority. It meant a woman had the luxury of staying indoors, protected from both the sun and the world. But beneath this ideal lay a much darker truth. Achieving that level of pallor wasn't easy, and the methods used were often painful, dangerous, and downright lethal. Women used all manner of concoctions to bleach their skin. One of the most common? Ceruse, a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar. This foundation gave the skin a ghostly white sheen, but came at the cost of slow poisoning. Over time, it corroded the skin, caused neurological damage, and led to early death. Still, it was used religiously because the pressure to appear untouched by sun or blemish was so intense. Some women even bled themselves or used leeches to drain color from their cheeks, thinking the paler their face, the more divine their appearance. And yet, the line between beauty and sickness became blurred. A woman too pale could be seen as weak or dying. So to correct this, rouge made from crushed insects, iron oxide, or even animal blood was dabbed on the cheeks and lips to simulate just enough healthy color. The contradiction was stark. Women had to appear sickly but not sick, delicate but not dying, otherworldly but still human. Of course, this beauty standard was only attainable to those with wealth or servants. Peasant women who worked in the fields had no choice but to be sun-kissed and strong, and they were rarely considered beautiful by noble standards. Their natural appearance was seen as vulgar, masculine, or sinful. The skin they lived in, darkened by labor, hardened by wind, was proof of their status, and therefore their unworthiness. Meanwhile, noble women hid behind powders, paints, and veils, hoping to meet an impossible ideal without letting anyone see the effort behind it. The irony is, these rituals weren't just tolerated, they were praised as signs of virtue. Women who suffered in silence to look pale were considered modest and moral. Pain was part of the package, and the paler the skin, the more perfect the woman. But behind every glowing complexion was a story of slow poisoning, suppressed identity, and sacrifice for beauty that hurt far more than it healed. In today's world, eyebrows are shaped, styled, dyed, and celebrated, but in medieval Europe, they were erased. The ideal woman was not supposed to have visible eyebrows at all. Smooth, blank foreheads were considered a mark of sophistication and high breeding. A bare brow wasn't just a preference, it was an expectation, especially among noble women. And so, women plucked, shaved, or scraped their brows into oblivion, even going as far as to rub their skin with walnut oil, vinegar, or ammonium salts to make the hair stop growing entirely. Why this obsession with a hairless brow? It came down to one word: control. A smooth, open forehead was seen as a sign of clarity and submission. The more bare and empty the upper half of the face appeared, the more demure and refined the woman was believed to be. Expression was minimized, emotion dulled. The face became a still canvas, beautiful only in how much of itself it gave up. The more blank space, the more beauty. It was a paradox of presence through absence. Eyebrows, after all, are powerful. They shape the face, express feeling, create identity. Removing them erased not only the features, but the individuality they represented. In a world where women were not allowed to speak freely, this erasure was symbolic. It wasn't just about looking pretty, it was about appearing passive, agreeable, and without defiance. Some women took it further by also removing eyelashes or plucking temples to create the illusion of an even higher brow and longer face. The pain was real, the tools crude, tweezers made from bone, scrapers of iron, and sometimes bare fingernails. And all of this was done in secret, behind veils and bedroom doors. To be caught beautifying oneself was to risk moral judgment, but to appear without these standards fulfilled was to risk being seen as low class or improper. Not surprisingly, some women found ways to rebel. They began to paint faint brows in unnatural shapes, thin lines that arched too high or looped like ink strokes. Others darkened the space with charcoal or soot, reasserting their right to self-expression in subtle, coded defiance. These were quiet rebellions, easily wiped away if questioned, but they mattered. The removal of eyebrows wasn't just a quirky trend, it was a powerful visual metaphor. It was about erasing identity in favor of obedience, smoothing away selfhood to become whatever the world needed a woman to be. And yet, even in that erasure, women found ways to reclaim space, to be seen, even if only for a moment. One of the most visually baffling trends in medieval beauty was the obsession with a high forehead. While today a full hairline is often associated with youth and beauty, in the Middle Ages, women were encouraged to remove the hair at the top of their foreheads to create the illusion of a tall, domed skull. It wasn't about looking youthful, it was about looking refined, wise, and aristocratic. The more space above the eyebrows, the more noble and controlled a woman appeared. To achieve this exaggerated look, women would pluck, shave, or even singe away the front of their hairline. Some used warm stones to burn the roots or rubbed in acidic herbs and mixtures to prevent regrowth. The process was painful and could result in scabbing, infections, or permanent bald spots. But those risks were dismissed in favor of appearing properly ladylike. A high forehead symbolized elevated thinking and purity, while a naturally low or rounded hairline was considered wild, animalistic, or common. This beauty ideal wasn't just cosmetic, it was social and moral. The forehead was seen as the seat of reason, so enlarging it visually was a way to signal a woman's self-control and virtue. Ironically, the intelligence that a large forehead was supposed to represent was rarely something women were allowed to express openly. It was purely symbolic, another layer of performance demanded by the culture around them. The higher the forehead, the more aristocratic a woman appeared. In some portraits, foreheads stretched so far back that the hair seemed to start at the crown of the skull. These images became standard in illuminated manuscripts and frescoes, reinforcing the trend. Noble women were literally reshaping their faces to fit into a mold of upper-class perfection. But what's even more haunting is the silence that accompanied it. Women rarely complained about the pain or the absurdity of the look. It was just another step in the long, invisible ritual of transformation, a ritual that demanded sacrifice without acknowledgement. And once again, the less a woman looked like herself, the more beautiful she was believed to be. Medieval cosmetics were often more deadly than divine. Women seeking flawless skin, rosy cheeks, or smooth complexions frequently applied concoctions that would horrify a modern dermatologist. Lead, mercury, vinegar, arsenic, alum, quicklime. These weren't found in the dungeon or the apothecary's poison shelf, but in beauty jars used every single day. The line between a cosmetic and a corrosive substance was not just thin, it didn't exist. One of the most notorious examples was Venetian ceruse, a white lead-based paste used as a foundation to create the prized ghostly complexion. It could produce a porcelain effect, hiding scars, pimples, and any hint of sun exposure. But with repeated use, it also caused lesions, neurological damage, and death. Women knew this. They saw their skin rot and their health decline, but still, they continued. Because looking beautiful wasn't optional. It was a social requirement with no mercy for refusal. Rouge and lip stains were made with red lead, crushed beetles, or iron oxide. These too were absorbed through the skin. Ointments designed to remove freckles or moles contained mercury or sulfur and would blister the face. Hair removal creams used burnt lime and vinegar, leaving chemical burns. And because mirrors were rare and glass was expensive, many women didn't even see the full extent of the damage until it was too late. Yet society framed this pain as noble sacrifice. A woman who ruined her health to appear beautiful was seen as virtuous, even holy. Enduring disfigurement, in the name of elegance, was praised as the mark of true femininity. Those who refused or who showed the scars were called vain, shameful, or accused of trying to seduce men with false beauty. The irony is cruel. Women were poisoned and then blamed for their suffering. Not all women had access to these costly materials. Peasant women resorted to natural dyes, berries, and clays, but these too came with risks, especially when combined with local folklore or poorly understood herbal medicine. And still, the expectation persisted. No matter the class, women were judged by appearance, yet they were not allowed to speak of the damage that pursuit caused. Toxic beauty was not a mistake of ignorance. It was a system built on pain, controlled by men, normalized by religion, and enforced by social rules. The more invisible the suffering, the more acceptable it became. And for many women, beauty meant slowly dying, while pretending everything was fine. In the rigidly stratified society of medieval Europe, beauty was not just a matter of aesthetics, it was a signal of class. A woman's appearance could instantly place her on the social ladder, and the divide between how noble women and peasant women were expected to look was both stark and unforgiving. Beauty standards weren't universal, they were custom-tailored to reflect power, wealth, and obedience. For noble women, beauty was about delicacy, refinement, and inaccessibility. For peasants, it was about survival, labor, and invisibility. A noble woman was expected to look as though she had never worked a day in her life. Her skin had to be pale, untouched by sunlight or soil. Her hands were to be soft, her nails clean, her hair styled with oils and braids. She was meant to embody virtue, purity, and grace, qualities symbolized by an appearance carefully maintained by servants and expensive potions. Beauty rituals were time-consuming and ritualistic, with entire mornings spent applying layers of powder, rouge, and perfumes. Her clothing, too, was designed to enhance her beauty while restricting movement, a visual metaphor for the constraints placed on women of high rank. In contrast, peasant women had neither the time nor resources to meet such expectations. They labored in fields, tended livestock, carried water, and bore children under the open sky. Their skin darkened from sun, their hands were calloused, and their hair often unadorned and hidden under plain linen coifs. Yet despite their hardships, they were judged harshly for failing to conform to the beauty ideals set by the elite. The irony was brutal. Peasant women were punished for not appearing noble, though their lives made such beauty impossible. This divide wasn't just visual, it was enforced through laws and religious pressure. Sumptuary laws dictated what materials, colors, and accessories a woman could wear based on her class. A peasant caught mimicking noble style could face fines or worse. Even beauty became property, owned by the elite, denied to the poor. But beauty among the lower classes was not absent, it simply existed in a different form. Peasant women celebrated small rituals of adornment that reflected resilience and creativity. A sprig of rosemary pinned to a braid, a ribbon dyed with berries, a hand-sewn bodice stitched with care. These quiet acts of self-expression didn't mirror noble ideals, but they held their own beauty, rooted in survival and personal pride. And while history preserved the portraits of queens and duchesses, the true face of the medieval woman, sunburnt, strong, and scarred, was largely forgotten. Today, cleanliness is seen as essential to beauty and health, but in medieval Europe, frequent washing, especially for women, was treated with suspicion, fear, and sometimes even moral condemnation. Cleanliness was not always considered virtuous. In fact, the Church often warned that excessive concern with bathing was a sign of vanity, pride, or even lust. For a woman to care too much about her appearance, especially in the realm of cleanliness, was to risk her reputation. This was made worse by the widespread belief that water could weaken the body or open the pores to disease. Physicians of the time often argued that water, especially hot water, could unbalance the humors and make one vulnerable to illness. Some even claimed that bathing during certain phases of the moon or menstrual cycles could be deadly. So while nobles had access to baths and perfumes, they used them sparingly and always with a veil of caution and superstition. For women, this meant that the ideal was not only to look pristine, but to achieve that look without openly washing. Perfumed cloths, herbal smoked garments, and powders were used to mask body odor. Dry washing, rubbing the skin with linen and scented oils, was more common than actual immersion. Public bathhouses did exist, but were often associated with sin, lust, or prostitution. A woman seen frequenting them risked more than whispers. She risked being labeled immoral. This created a strange contradiction. A woman was expected to appear fresh, fragrant, and clean, but never be seen doing the work to make it so. Her beauty had to be effortless, or at least appear so. Meanwhile, men could wash more freely, especially if it related to health or spiritual purification. Women, however, had to navigate their hygiene in secret, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, balancing their need for cleanliness with fear of judgment. In religious life, nuns often avoided bathing entirely as an act of spiritual discipline. To deny the body was to elevate the soul. In one extreme case, a saint was praised for not washing for decades, her stench described in miraculous terms. In this world, suffering was seen as holy, and beauty, especially cleanliness, had to be masked in humility or sacrifice. So while modern beauty routines include exfoliation, skin care, and luxurious baths, medieval women faced a paradox. Look clean, but don't be seen cleaning. Smell sweet, but avoid suspicion. Show grace, but never show effort. Their hygiene, like so much else in their lives, was another space where they had to be perfect without ever being obvious. In the medieval imagination, beauty was all about the surface, smooth skin, empty brows, a still face. But there was one part of the body that drew very little admiration: the teeth. In fact, teeth were rarely spoken of in the context of beauty at all. Instead, they were associated with age, decay, and sometimes evil. A beautiful smile, the kind that today is a standard of charm, was not celebrated. Quite the opposite. In most portraits, women are shown with closed lips and unreadable expressions. Showing your teeth, especially as a woman, was often considered crude, wild, or vulgar. Good dental hygiene, as we understand it now, didn't exist. Toothbrushes were rare, and toothpaste as we know it was centuries away. Most people used cloth, twigs, or ash mixtures to scrub their teeth, if they cleaned them at all, and sugar, which became more common by the late medieval period, only made things worse. Blackened, rotten, or missing teeth were widespread, even among the wealthy. Yet no one talked about fixing them, not because the problem wasn't there, but because acknowledging it threatened the illusion of noble grace. Women, in particular, had to hide their teeth at all costs. Smiling was discouraged. A woman who showed her teeth in public was seen as too forward, too expressive, or even morally suspect. Laughter was meant to be restrained, not joyful, and if a woman had damaged teeth, she might resort to darkening powders, mouth coverings, or keeping her face turned away in conversation. In art and literature, women were praised for their silence, their reserve, their stillness. A wide smile didn't fit the mold. But the fear went beyond appearances. In some regions, visible dental damage or irregular teeth were linked to witchcraft. Crooked smiles, tooth gaps, or discolored gums could be interpreted as signs of spiritual corruption or demonic influence. Women already walking the thin line between acceptable beauty and suspicion had one more reason to hide their mouths. Among the upper classes, wealthy women sometimes soaked their mouths with herbal tinctures to try to whiten the teeth or freshen the breath. Cloves, mint, and vinegar were common, though the acidic mixtures often eroded enamel even faster. Among the poor, people made do with chewing herbs or rinsing with salt water, though the results were rarely satisfying. In the medieval world, teeth were something to be concealed, not celebrated. A perfect woman was one who never spoke too much, never laughed too loudly, and never revealed too much of herself, including her smile. And so, the teeth became one more part of a woman's body she had to control, obscure, and suffer in silence. Hair, especially a woman's hair, held deep symbolic power in the Middle Ages, and that power often worked against her. Flowing hair was seen as a dangerous temptation, a sign of vanity or seduction. It was thought to attract sin, to stir lust, and to betray the inner state of the soul. For this reason, women were expected to cover their hair, hide it, or even shave it entirely. A woman who let her hair fall freely in public wasn't seen as bold or fashionable, she was seen as shameful. This belief wasn't just cultural, it was deeply religious. The church taught that a woman's hair was her crowning glory, and thus it had to be concealed. St. Paul's writings were often cited. Women should cover their heads as a sign of submission. Nuns shaved their heads upon entering the convent. Married women wore wimples, veils, or elaborate headdresses. Only virgins were allowed to display their hair publicly, and even then, only under controlled circumstances like weddings or festivals. The social consequences of exposing your hair were severe. A woman with uncovered hair could be mistaken for a prostitute, or worse, a witch. In some towns, women were fined or shamed publicly for refusing to veil themselves. And in cases of infidelity or moral scandal, one of the first punishments was often the forced cutting or shaving of a woman's hair, a symbolic stripping away of her identity and status. Even within the boundaries of modesty, hair had to be styled carefully. It had to be clean but not too fragrant, orderly but not showy. Women braided their hair into intricate coils, twisted it into buns, or pinned it beneath layers of cloth. Hair was not for pleasure, it was for discipline. To tend to it too much was vanity. To leave it too loose was sin. And yet, behind closed doors, many women still cherished their hair as a private expression of self. Mothers taught their daughters how to oil and braid it, how to scent it with herbs, how to weave small tokens into the strands. These moments of care were hidden, sacred, and fleeting. For most of a woman's life, her hair belonged not to her, but to the expectations of others. Hair was a paradox, a symbol of both power and punishment, pride and peril. It was a natural part of the body turned into a battleground of control. And for medieval women, learning how to manage that delicate balance became just another part of surviving in a world ruled by rules. Scent played a curious role in the medieval woman's world. Smelling pleasant was undeniably part of being perceived as beautiful, but there was a narrow path to walk. A delicate fragrance was seen as a mark of cleanliness and refinement, yet an overly strong scent could quickly invite accusations of vanity, seduction, or moral corruption. The right balance was essential, and the rules were unspoken but strictly observed. Women of the upper class often kept small vessels of perfumed oil or dried herbs tucked in their garments. These perfumes were crafted from lavender, rose petals, cloves, cinnamon, and other imported spices, often mixed with animal fat or oil as a carrier. The ingredients were expensive, and their possession was a clear marker of wealth and status. A gentle whiff of rosewater could suggest nobility. A trace of clove might hint at exotic sophistication. But if the scent lingered too long or traveled too far, it could be considered inappropriate. The Church, ever watchful over female modesty, warned that excessive perfume was a tool of temptation. It was said to lure men into lustful thoughts and distract them from God. A woman who smelled too enticing might be accused of seducing men without ever saying a word. Sermons condemned sweet-smelling harlots, and it was believed by some that demons could ride on perfume to corrupt the soul. Fragrance, in this context, became another weapon in the ongoing war between virtue and sin. But medieval women also used scent for protection and survival. In a world where bathing was rare and disease spread rapidly, sweet smells offered comfort and a sense of control. Herbal sachets were sewn into undergarments. Gloves were perfumed. Hair was combed with scented oils not only for appearance but to ward off illness, which many believed traveled through foul air. Perfume was beauty, yes, but also armor. Peasant women, lacking access to imported spices or oils, relied on local plants: rosemary, sage, marjoram, mint. These herbs were grown in cottage gardens and passed down through generations as part of domestic healing and daily care. Their scent was more subtle, earthy, and tied to the land, but no less important to the women who used them. The perfume of a medieval woman was not applied for pleasure or luxury. It was worn carefully, subtly, like a whisper of presence that said, "I am clean, I am proper, I am not dangerous." One drop too many, though, and that message could shift in an instant. Her scent, like her body, had to be perfectly controlled or else risk drawing the wrong kind of attention. While lip color might seem like a modern obsession, medieval women also craved that soft red tint to the lips that suggested youth, health, and gentle femininity. But just like everything else in their appearance, it came with rules: too much red, and a woman was accused of vanity or even witchcraft; too little, and she risked appearing sickly or low class. And, worst of all, the ingredients used to achieve those rosy tones were frequently dangerous, if not outright poisonous. The materials available to color lips ranged from the natural to the toxic. Some women used crushed berries, blackberries, elderberries, or cherries, smeared lightly with animal fat for shine. Others turned to iron oxide, a reddish pigment found in clay, which could be applied as a fine dust. But in wealthier circles, lip color was often made from cinnabar, a mercury-based compound with a bright red hue. It offered vibrant color, but it also caused mercury poisoning over time, resulting in tremors, mood swings, and irreversible organ damage. And yet, a red mouth was seen as elegant, flirtatious, and young. A faint flush was enough to suggest good health and noble blood. A woman's lips were expected to be visible but not bold, enticing but not assertive. Painted lips could become a source of scandal. Too much rouge, and a woman could be labeled loose, dangerous, or even diabolical. Some clerics went so far as to declare red lips a tool of the devil, meant to lead righteous men astray. Because of this, many women applied lip color in private and denied it in public. The act had to be invisible, the transformation silent. Just like skin whitening or eyebrow removal, lip tinting was part of the secret ritual of self-erasure, making oneself beautiful enough to be acceptable, but never obvious enough to be noticed for the effort. It was a fragile balance between being admired and being accused. In some communities, especially where puritanical values were strong, women could be shunned or penalized for wearing visible makeup. They were told that natural beauty was a gift from God, and anything added to it was a lie. But natural beauty, ironically, still had to match the social ideal. If a woman's lips were too pale or dry, she was seen as lazy or uncared for. The pressure to meet expectations never ceased, it just shifted form. Lip color was not an accessory. It was a risk, a rebellion, and sometimes a poison. And for medieval women, even the faintest shade of red carried the weight of scrutiny, danger, and desire. In a society obsessed with modesty, control, and the illusion of perfection, veils became one of the most important beauty accessories a woman could wear. But they weren't about enhancement, they were about concealment. A veil in medieval Europe was not just a piece of fabric, it was a boundary. It separated the private from the public, the pure from the profane. It marked a woman's status, her stage in life, and her willingness, or refusal, to play by society's rules. Young girls, once they reached puberty, were expected to cover their heads in church and often in public, depending on regional custom. Unmarried women could sometimes wear their hair loosely braided or partially visible, but once married, the veil became a visual contract. A married woman was expected to shield her beauty from the world. Her face might be visible, but her hair, considered one of the most tempting parts of her body, was to be hidden. The veil announced, "I belong to someone now. I am no longer for your eyes." There were countless variations of head coverings, simple linen veils, elaborately folded wimples, and towering hennons that turned the veil into a symbol of opulence. But whether modest or grand, they served the same purpose, to regulate the gaze. A woman behind a veil was both protected and erased. She was less visible, and therefore, theoretically, less vulnerable to sin, desire, or judgment. Yet the veil also became a form of quiet power. In courtly love, poets romanticized the glimpse beneath a veil. A flash of cheek, a flutter of fabric, a strand of hair slipping loose, these tiny accidents became the height of eroticism in a world where women's bodies were constantly hidden. Women, aware of this power, learned to navigate it. Some adjusted their veils just so. Others chose more transparent fabrics or colored dyes to let suggestion do what open display could not. Still, failing to veil appropriately could bring harsh consequences. Women accused of promiscuity were often shamed with their veils forcibly removed. In religious orders, nuns who broke rules might be punished by being made to wear their veils backward. And during moral panics, even noble women could be criticized for appearing too visible. It was not just about morality, it was about submission, obedience, and silence. To be seen, even slightly, was to take a risk, and for medieval women, the veil was both prison and performance, a piece of cloth that told the world what kind of woman they were allowed to be. Today, mirrors are tools of self-awareness, style, and confidence. But in the Middle Ages, a woman's access to her own reflection was limited and often considered dangerous. Mirrors were expensive, fragile, and rare. Most women, even among the nobility, owned only small, distorted pieces of polished metal or obsidian, and these gave a dark, incomplete image. Seeing one's face clearly was a luxury, one that carried heavy moral suspicion. The Church warned that mirrors encouraged vanity and pride. To gaze at oneself too long was seen as a form of idolatry, a sin of narcissism that could draw a woman away from humility and spiritual duty. Sermons warned that Satan whispered from mirrors, encouraging women to focus on their bodies instead of their souls. A woman too aware of her beauty was thought to be closer to sin. Because of this, many women learned to beautify themselves by feel, habit, or the guidance of others. They plucked, painted, and braided without ever seeing the full result. The mystery of their own face was part of their identity. Some noble women had access to silver-backed mirrors brought from the East, but even these were often kept under lock and key, used sparingly, if at all. In art and literature, mirrors were sometimes portrayed as tools of witches or seductresses. A woman holding a mirror was rarely painted as innocent. She was suggestive, clever, and dangerous. This created a culture in which seeing one's reflection was not empowering, it was suspect. Women were expected to know how to look beautiful without looking at themselves. Beauty had to be innate or secret, not something pursued through effort. Yet despite these warnings, many women still sought mirrors in quiet defiance. They carved reflective surfaces into jewelry, polished armor pieces for glimpses, or asked their servants to describe their appearance. The desire to know oneself, to truly see one's own face, was powerful, even if it had to remain hidden. Mirrors in medieval life weren't just about vanity, they were about control. Denying women the ability to see themselves helped reinforce the belief that their beauty was for others to judge, not for themselves to understand. And in this way, one of the most basic acts of self-recognition became another way to limit and silence them. In medieval times, a woman's hands were more than just tools, they were silent messengers. Softness, shape, and cleanliness all carried meaning. To possess pale, delicate hands with smooth nails was to signal wealth, refinement, and high birth. To display rough skin, broken nails, or visible calluses was to betray a life of labor, which for a woman meant being seen as unfeminine or undesirable. As a result, hands became a hidden battlefield of class, beauty, and identity. Noble women rarely used their hands for work. Servants washed their garments, cooked their meals, and maintained their homes. Their hands, left unblemished, became visual proof of status. Rings adorned each finger. Perfumed balms softened the skin. Long sleeves covered them delicately, and gloves, often made of fine leather, linen, or silk, shielded them from both sun and dirt. In portraits and manuscripts, noble women were often shown with their hands poised in graceful gestures, fingers long and tapered, untouched by toil. In contrast, peasant women's hands told another story. Rough from harvesting, scarred from spinning, burned from cooking fires, these hands were tools of survival. And though their beauty was real, shaped by strength and skill, society did not see it that way. They were rarely praised, never romanticized, and often looked down upon. A woman's hands could betray her no matter how clean her face or costly her dress. Manicures, as we know them, did not exist. But noble women still took great care with their nails. Some stained them subtly with herbal dyes or polished them with smooth stones. Others soaked their hands in milk, honey, or vinegar to soften the skin. Every action aimed to preserve the illusion of gentleness and leisure, even if maintaining that illusion required hidden effort. Hands had to appear effortless. The moment they showed signs of actual labor, a woman risked losing her place in the social script. The church added its own layers of control. Women were warned not to adorn their hands with excess. Vanity, again, was the enemy. And yet, religious paintings often depicted holy women with luminous, perfect hands, a contradiction that only heightened pressure. Women had to appear angelic without appearing proud. A noble woman's hands, held just right, could show obedience, chastity, and grace. A peasant woman's hands, no matter how capable or beautiful in their own way, were not granted the same symbolic power. In a world where class and femininity were bound so tightly together, even a woman's fingertips became part of the performance. Eyes, windows to the soul, so the saying goes. But in medieval society, a woman's eyes were both praised and feared. They could be a symbol of innocence or a threat of seduction. A downward gaze showed modesty. A direct one could be interpreted as forwardness or even witchcraft. The medieval woman had to master the art of looking without being seen as looking, of observing the world without drawing suspicion upon herself. Large, wide eyes were considered the height of beauty. They were thought to represent purity, grace, and submissiveness. Artists exaggerated them in portraits, and poets praised doe-like eyes in courtly verse. But that ideal came with restrictions. A woman's gaze was supposed to be soft, lowered, indirect. Anything more was dangerous. Looking too long, too directly, or too confidently was considered bold, a challenge to male authority. A woman's eyes could be her downfall. To enhance their beauty, women sometimes used drops made from belladonna, a toxic plant that dilated the pupils and gave the eyes a darker, glossier appearance. The results were dramatic but risky. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, could cause hallucinations, blurred vision, or blindness. Still, the effect was coveted enough that women applied it anyway, carefully, quietly, often in secret. Eyelashes and eyelids were sometimes darkened with charcoal, ash, or burnt herbs to create depth. But again, subtlety was essential. Too much darkness around the eyes could be seen as deceitful or unnatural. Religious leaders condemned women who tried to trick men with their appearance, claiming that cosmetic eyes were false and demonic. To make one's eyes too visible was to invite judgment and possibly danger. Expressions mattered just as much. A woman's eyes had to convey emotion without being too readable. Grief was acceptable, serenity was ideal, joy was risky, and desire was forbidden. Even in love poetry, the most a woman could do was let her eyes speak while her mouth remained closed. In this way, eyes became a form of silent communication, used to navigate strict rules without ever openly breaking them. And yet, even under all these restrictions, women found power in their gaze. A glance could spark a courtly romance, defy a suitor, or communicate sisterhood in silence. In a world that tried so hard to limit women's voices, their eyes remained the one part of them that still had something to say. One of the most striking, and to modern eyes, unsettling, beauty standards of the medieval era was the complete removal of eyebrows. In elite society, bare brows were the mark of high fashion. To have thick or expressive eyebrows was to be seen as wild, unrefined, or overly emotional. A smooth, empty forehead was the ideal, symbolizing composure, submission, and aristocratic control. And so, for many women, beauty began with plucking themselves into silence. Eyebrows were meticulously removed using tweezers, knives, or waxes made from resin and herbs. The pain was intense, but the reward was a forehead that looked larger and more intelligent, echoing the prevailing belief that the upper face was where grace and nobility resided. A bare brow cleared the way for spiritual beauty, at least in the eyes of religious and aristocratic authorities. The trend didn't stop with the eyebrows. Many women also plucked their eyelashes or thinned them significantly, believing that bare eyes appeared more innocent or divine. In portraits, especially of noble women and queens, faces were stripped of much of their natural emotion. The lack of brows contributed to this blank, serene appearance, a visual symbol of control over the body, the soul, and the self. This aesthetic wasn't just about looking elegant. It was about erasing physical traits associated with emotion and personality. Eyebrows, after all, express anger, surprise, defiance. To remove them was to remove signs of resistance. A smooth brow meant submission, quiet, peace. It was not enough for a woman to behave modestly. She had to wear that modesty on her face. As with many medieval beauty rituals, there was danger beneath the surface. Some women used corrosive pastes made of quicklime or arsenic to prevent regrowth. These substances could cause permanent scarring or infection, but as long as the outer appearance fit the social mold, the damage underneath didn't matter. In fact, it often went unnoticed, or worse, was considered proof of commitment. The bare brow trend also reveals the intense pressure to conform, even at the cost of individuality. Today, eyebrows are celebrated for their ability to frame the face and express personality. In the Middle Ages, they were treated as something to eliminate in the pursuit of conformity. A woman without brows was not meant to be read, she was meant to be admired from a distance, like a painting in a chapel. In medieval times, true feminine beauty wasn't about movement, it was about stillness. A woman's grace was measured by her ability to be calm, controlled, and contained. The more still she appeared, the more beautiful she was believed to be. Movement suggested emotion, desire, or restlessness. Stillness, on the other hand, represented obedience, patience, and purity, virtues demanded by both the church and society. This ideal came from deep cultural roots. The Virgin Mary, the ultimate model of feminine virtue, was always depicted with a soft, fixed gaze and a posture of serene immobility. Saints, too, were often shown in poses of perfect stillness, eyes lifted to heaven, hands folded, lips closed. For medieval women, these images weren't just art, they were instruction. To be beautiful was to mimic the divine, and that meant moving as little as possible. Clothing reinforced this ideal. Tight bodices, heavy skirts, veils, and stiff layers of linen made movement difficult. Sitting gracefully became an art. A woman was admired for how still she could be during meals, ceremonies, and church services. If she walked slowly. If she spoke softly. A noble woman was trained to be the center of attention without ever appearing to seek it. This aesthetic extended even into romance. Courtly love poems praised the unmoving lady who inspired devotion simply by existing. She did not chase or respond. She remained aloof, distant, framed like a statue. The more unreachable she seemed, the more desirable she became. Beauty became a kind of sacred inaccessibility, something admired but never touched, watched but never fully known. But this stillness came at a cost. Women were denied the freedom to dance, run, gesture, or even laugh too openly. Expression had to be minimal, graceful, and safe. Joy could be mistaken for boldness, pain for hysteria, anger for rebellion. In a world where emotion was policed, stillness became a survival tactic. It also meant that inner suffering could be hidden in plain sight. A woman could be in pain, emotional, physical, or spiritual, but as long as she held still, she was considered beautiful. Her silence, her stillness, her restraint were seen as signs of perfection, even holiness. And so, countless women learned to sit quietly through agony, praised all the while for their poise. Stillness wasn't just a fashion or a manner, it was a system, one that kept women frozen in place, beautiful only as long as they didn't move. In the Middle Ages, beauty was not measured in strength, vitality, or athleticism. Instead, the ideal body for a woman was fragile, delicate to the point of appearing almost ill. Pale skin, thin limbs, a slight frame, and visible bones were admired features. The closer a woman looked to fading away, the more beautiful she was believed to be. This vision of beauty aligned perfectly with the expectations of submission, modesty, and fragility that medieval society prized in women. A plump body, associated with wealth in some other historical periods, was not considered attractive in many medieval courtly circles. Instead, the thinness of noble women symbolized restraint, discipline, and control. It was also a marker of class. Poor women were more likely to have stronger bodies from labor and inconsistent food supply. But for noble women, who could afford to fast for beauty's sake, appearing underfed and fragile was a fashion statement, one that mirrored their lack of physical involvement in the harsher aspects of life. Fasting was sometimes used deliberately for beauty. In some cases, religious devotion provided cover for aesthetic goals. Women who restricted their diets were often praised for their holiness, especially when they claimed they were feeding on the body of Christ instead of food. But behind this spiritual performance often lay a desire to maintain a socially approved appearance, thin, weak, and ethereal. Clothing reinforced this frailty. Tight bodices and heavy gowns flattened curves and made walking or standing for long periods exhausting. Corset-like garments weren't yet as extreme as later centuries, but the layered and constraining outfits limited mobility and subtly shaped the figure into one of narrowness and elegance. And because movement was discouraged, posture became essential. A woman who slouched was considered lazy or immoral. She had to be upright, refined, and still, like a delicate piece of porcelain. This preference for frailty wasn't just about aesthetics. It was deeply connected to power. A woman who was fragile needed protection. She couldn't survive without a man's care. Her appearance reinforced the idea that she was passive, dependent, and obedient. Strength, in body or will, was seen as a threat. And yet, women's bodies were incredibly resilient. They bore children, survived disease, managed households, and labored in quiet ways. But these strengths were rarely celebrated. Instead, they were hidden beneath layers of silk and expectation, while the fantasy of frailty was painted in every portrait and woven into every poem. Though corsets, as we know them, were not fully developed in the medieval period, the concept of controlling and shaping a woman's body with tight garments was already well in place. Women were often laced into snug bodices and underdresses that compressed the torso and lifted the bust. These garments restricted breathing and movement, all in the name of appearing graceful, composed, and aristocratic. To be beautiful was to be bound and breathless. These early garments weren't purely functional. They were designed to create a specific silhouette: narrow shoulders, cinched waist, a long upper torso that flowed into layers of fabric. The body underneath was hidden, its natural shape masked by stitching and structure. Beauty was not what a woman was born with, it was what she could endure to create. Tightly laced clothing served many purposes. First, it signaled class. Only wealthy women could afford clothing tailored to shape the body. Second, it enforced posture. A straight back, high chest, and closed arms all contributed to the image of a disciplined, silent woman. And third, it reinforced obedience. The garments were often too complicated to put on alone. A woman needed assistance to dress, making it easier for family or servants to monitor her appearance and behavior. The discomfort was constant. Breathing deeply was difficult. Sitting for long periods in stiff dresses could cause numbness or swelling. Some women fainted regularly, not due to illness, but because their clothing compressed their ribs and lungs, yet fainting was seen as feminine. A woman who swooned was considered delicate, graceful, even desirable. Her weakness became a social performance. Religious leaders sometimes condemned overly tight clothing, claiming it encouraged vanity or incited lust. But the social pressure to maintain the proper form usually outweighed such warnings. Mothers taught daughters how to lace properly. Servants learned to tug and tie without bruising. Pain became part of the beauty ritual, a silent contract between body and society. Peasant women, by contrast, wore looser, more practical garments. Their clothing allowed for movement, labor, and breathing. But that freedom came at the cost of being seen as unrefined or coarse. In medieval eyes, the more tightly bound a woman was, the more beautiful and obedient she appeared. In the end, tightly laced beauty was not about fashion. It was about control. Every string pulled tighter reminded women that even their breath was not entirely their own. Pale skin was not just a beauty ideal in the medieval world. It was a status symbol, a statement, and for many women, a painful pursuit. The logic behind the preference was simple. Tanned skin meant outdoor labor, and outdoor labor meant poverty. So, if a woman could show off porcelain white skin, she was declaring to the world that she was above toil, untouched by sun or sweat, and firmly planted in the upper echelons of society. But nature didn't always cooperate. Even noble women stepped outside, traveled, or were exposed to sun through windows and courtyards. To maintain that prized whiteness, they turned to an array of powders, paints, and potions, many of which were toxic. One of the most popular ingredients was lead. White lead powder was used to cover blemishes, lighten the complexion, and create the ghostly glow that defined high-class beauty. It worked, briefly. Then it began to burn, scar, and poison. Other skin-lightening methods included vinegar washes, chalk dust, ground pearls, and mixtures made from egg whites, alum, or even mercury. Women applied these in layers, sometimes baking them onto the skin in the sun. The effect could be striking if one ignored the health consequences. Hair loss, skin corrosion, and in severe cases, organ failure were common results. But because these effects developed slowly, and because vanity was framed as devotion to one's husband or station, the risk was often accepted. Even clothing and behavior reinforced this ideal. Women wore hoods, long sleeves, and gloves to protect their skin from exposure. Parasols and wide-brimmed hats helped shield the face. In some cases, women even carried fans to create shade or sat indoors during daylight hours. A pale face wasn't just painted, it was preserved with great effort and discipline. The church, unsurprisingly, had mixed feelings. On one hand, pale skin was linked to saintliness and purity. Many holy figures were described in religious texts as having luminous white faces. On the other, vanity was a sin. So, women walked a narrow line. They had to appear pure without seeming proud, beautiful without being accused of trying too hard. And for those born with darker complexions, especially in southern regions or lower classes, the pressure could be crushing. Some tried to lighten their skin with home remedies, others were simply left out of the beauty narrative altogether. Fairness wasn't just an aesthetic, it became a tool of exclusion, separating the admired from the invisible. In the medieval beauty hierarchy, pale skin was the crown, but like many crowns, it was heavy, costly, and sometimes deadly to wear. In medieval Europe, skin imperfections weren't just blemishes, they were considered signs of sin, misfortune, or even demonic presence. Freckles, moles, birthmarks, and scars were not simply viewed as quirks of appearance. They were interpreted through a lens of superstition, fear, and rigid beauty norms. A woman's skin was expected to be smooth, pale, and unmarked. Anything else invited whispers, or worse, accusations. Freckles were especially suspicious, though we know today that they are caused by sun exposure and genetics. In the Middle Ages, they were seen as a result of disorder in the body or mind. Some thought they signaled an overabundance of heat or blood, which was believed to be connected to a passionate or unruly temperament. A freckled woman, then, was not just flawed, she was potentially dangerous. Moles carried even more risk. In a time when witchcraft accusations could ruin lives, moles and birthmarks were sometimes labeled as witches' marks. These were thought to be physical tokens given by the devil, places where evil spirits could feed. If a woman had an unusual mark, especially in a hidden or intimate area, it could be used as evidence against her in a trial. The body was no longer private, it became a canvas on which society projected suspicion. To combat these fears, women went to painful lengths to conceal or erase such marks. Lemon juice, vinegar, and harsh scrubbing were used to try and bleach spots away. Ashes and soot were sometimes rubbed in to even out the skin tone. Others applied thick layers of white powder or tinted paste to mask their imperfections, creating a ghostly, painted version of their natural appearance. Those lucky enough to have unblemished skin were praised endlessly in poetry and art. Their beauty was described as divine, their faces likened to untouched snow or polished ivory. Meanwhile, women with visible marks, even those unrelated to illness or injury, faced exclusion from these romantic and spiritual ideals. What made this worse was the randomness of nature. A birthmark or mole was not chosen, nor was it a reflection of character. But in a world desperate to read meaning into every detail, these marks became symbols of inner truth, whether true or not. Women had to live with the knowledge that their bodies might betray them, that a single freckle could cast doubt on their purity, and that beauty was not just about how you looked, but how spotless your skin could appear. Hair, perhaps more than any other physical feature, carried immense symbolic weight in the Middle Ages. For women, it was a paradoxical burden, both a sign of holiness and a source of temptation. It could reflect purity or sin, status or shame. And what was done with it, hidden, cut, braided, or displayed, spoke volumes about a woman's place in the social, spiritual, and moral hierarchy. In religious imagery, the Virgin Mary and female saints were often depicted with long, flowing hair, usually golden, soft, and radiant. This imagery suggested divine favor and purity, as though their hair was an outward reflection of their inner virtue. But outside of religious art, loose hair on a living woman told a different story. For unmarried girls, unbound hair could suggest innocence. For married women, it could hint at vanity or seduction. And for widows or nuns, long hair was a reminder of past identity, often shaved off upon entering religious life to symbolize humility and the renunciation of worldly beauty. Social class played a major role, too. Noble women grew their hair long and cared for it meticulously. It was oiled, combed, perfumed, and braided in elaborate styles that often involved headdresses, veils, or silk ribbons. Their hair became a display of wealth, groomed not for utility, but for admiration. In contrast, peasant women kept their hair practical, braided tightly or tucked beneath linen caps, more out of necessity than fashion. Yet even then, hair remained a point of personal pride and cultural identity. Showing one's hair in public was often discouraged or outright forbidden, depending on time and region. A woman who let her hair flow freely could be accused of indecency or rebellion. And in moments of punishment or public shame, a woman's hair might be deliberately cut off as a way of humiliating her, literally stripping her of her femininity and honor. This act turned beauty into disgrace, and something as personal as hair into a public weapon. Despite all this, many women still found ways to express themselves through their hair. They developed secret braiding patterns, shared oils and treatments, or wore their hair loose in private, claiming those moments for themselves. In a world that constantly tried to control their bodies, hair offered a rare space for quiet defiance. It could be wrapped in silk to please expectations, or untied to remind oneself of freedom. Hair in medieval life was never just hair. It was virtue. It was danger. It was history. Among the strangest beauty trends of the medieval period was the obsession with high foreheads. Women went to extraordinary lengths to extend their hairlines, believing that a tall, smooth forehead was the pinnacle of elegance and sophistication. To achieve this unnatural look, they would pluck the front of their hair, sometimes by the handful, to raise the hairline and give the illusion of an elongated, noble face. Why the obsession with foreheads? It stemmed partly from classical ideals of beauty, revived in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, where a high forehead symbolized intelligence, refinement, and divine proportion. But it also aligned perfectly with the Church's valorization of demureness. A woman with a high forehead and bare face looked less emotional, less animalistic, more composed. She appeared above the chaos of the world, untouched by passion or wildness. The process of plucking was painful and tedious. Women used tweezers, hot wax, or even rough cloths to yank out hair strand by strand. Some used poultices made of vinegar and walnut oil to weaken the follicles and slow regrowth. There were even recipes in medieval beauty manuals that promised to remove hair permanently, but often involved caustic chemicals that damaged the skin. This wasn't about comfort or practicality. It was about fitting into an ideal that made a woman's face less human, more symbolic. A vast, smooth forehead was like a canvas, blank, controlled, and serene. Emotions were suppressed. Features were softened or erased. Beauty, once again, became about disappearance. And of course, the forehead plucking trend didn't stand alone. It went hand in hand with the removal of eyebrows and eyelashes, turning the entire upper face into a field of silence. This aesthetic became so popular among the elite that portraits from the era show women with oddly alien, empty expressions, large eyes, hair pushed back to the crown of the skull, forehead stretching up toward veils and hennons like marble domes. Those who didn't conform to this ideal were often dismissed as common or ignorant. A woman with a natural hairline was considered lazy or proud. So the trend spread, even to those who couldn't afford the expensive treatments or tools, because not participating meant being left out of the beauty narrative entirely. And like many painful rituals, it was passed down mother to daughter, normalized as just what women do. But beneath the smooth foreheads and sculpted expressions was a deeper truth. Beauty in the Middle Ages often demanded sacrifice, and sometimes a piece of oneself. In an era without dentists or modern hygiene, clean white teeth were extremely rare, and yet they became another impossible ideal that noble women were expected to chase. A gleaming smile was associated with youth, health, and virtue. But for most medieval women, especially those of lower status, the reality was stained enamel, rotting molars, and chronic toothaches. Still, the pressure to achieve the perfect mouth remained, and women turned to painful and often dangerous methods to try to meet that standard. Tooth cleaning rituals varied from household to household, but for the nobility, mixtures of crushed herbs, ashes, salt, or ground bone were used as early toothpaste. Women would rub these powders onto their teeth using cloths, twigs, or even small bone scrapers. While mildly effective in removing surface stains, these abrasives also wore away enamel, making the teeth even more vulnerable to decay in the long term. Some formulas contained acidic ingredients like vinegar or lemon juice, which whitened teeth temporarily, but weakened them over time. Breath was also a major concern. Bad breath was viewed as not just a personal flaw, but a moral one. Sweet-smelling breath was a mark of purity and discipline, so women chewed mint leaves, fennel, cloves, or anise seeds regularly, both for fragrance and freshness. These practices weren't just about romance, they were about social survival. A woman who opened her mouth to speak or smile and revealed stained teeth or foul breath risked ridicule, even among her own class. For some, whitening went beyond cleaning. Recipes included chalk dust mixed with honey or wine, or even ground pearls, costly, impractical, and harmful. Some women were known to avoid certain foods like red wine or berries, fearing the staining effects, though the scarcity of food in general made such restraint a luxury. Others tried to color their lips subtly with herbal tints to make their teeth appear whiter by contrast. Despite all this effort, many noble women had visibly poor dental health by their 30s. Tooth loss was common, and the sight of blackened or missing teeth was often hidden behind carefully trained expressions, tight-lipped smiles or veils held close to the mouth. Artists often flattered their subjects, painting their mouths small and closed, not to show shyness, but to preserve the illusion of youth and dental perfection. The mouth, after all, was another battleground of beauty. A woman's voice, her smile, her breath, all had to align with the aesthetic of control, cleanliness, and restraint. And just like skin, hair, and eyes, teeth had to be tamed, no matter the pain involved. In an age where bathing was rare, indoor plumbing non-existent, and clothes were worn for days or weeks without washing, scent became a complicated and powerful element of beauty. For medieval women, smelling pleasant wasn't just a matter of attraction, it was deeply tied to health, morality, and class. A sweet-smelling woman was seen as clean, chaste, and spiritually pure. A foul odor, however natural, invited judgment and disgrace. Since regular bathing was discouraged by many religious authorities, believed to weaken the body or encourage vanity, women had to find other ways to maintain a pleasant aroma. The solution was perfume. But this wasn't the bottled luxury we know today. Medieval perfumes were hand-blended from herbs, flowers, spices, and resins. Popular ingredients included rosewater, lavender, myrrh, cinnamon, and clove. These mixtures were infused into oils or alcohol, then dabbed behind the ears, under the arms, or sewn into garments via scented sachets. Aromatics weren't just used on the body. Rooms were perfumed, veils were scented, and gloves were soaked in fragrant oils before being worn. The idea was to carry an aura of cleanliness and refinement, one that lingered in every movement. For noble women especially, perfume was as important as jewelry. It was a marker of luxury and distinction, separating them from the stench of the streets and the laboring poor. But like most things, perfume had a double edge. Too much scent could be interpreted as deceit or seduction. A woman who smelled too sweet was assumed to be hiding something, perhaps uncleanliness, perhaps worse. Religious leaders warned that perfume tempted men and distracted the faithful. Yet these same leaders praised the divine fragrance of saints and holy women. Once again, women had to strike a nearly impossible balance: smell pleasant, but not seductive; clean, but not vain. And perfumes weren't always safe. Some contained toxic elements like camphor, mercury, or even lead. Others used animal ingredients, musk, ambergris, civet, that carried ethical and spiritual baggage. Many perfumes irritated the skin or caused headaches. But as with so many medieval beauty rituals, women endured the risks to maintain the appearance of grace. For peasant women, access to perfumes was limited. They used fresh herbs tucked into their bodices or hair, or rubbed flower petals directly on their skin. These natural scents faded quickly, but offered a fleeting freshness in otherwise pungent environments. To be a beautiful woman in the Middle Ages was to smell like something otherworldly, something holy, unreachable, and untouched by the dirt of daily life. It was a fragrance born not of freedom, but of pressure. A perfume that masked not just the body, but the pain of being judged for simply existing in it. In medieval society, a woman's voice wasn't just something she used, it was something she was judged by. The pitch, the tone, the frequency with which she spoke, and even the way her voice traveled in a room all shaped how others perceived her character, beauty, and worth. A soft, high-pitched, rarely used voice was considered the most desirable. Anything else, too loud, too deep, too opinionated, was seen as unfeminine or even dangerous. Silence was not merely a virtue, it was a beauty standard. Noble women were trained to speak only when spoken to, and even then, to speak gently, modestly, and with minimal expression. Courtly literature often praised women for their sweet voices or their angelic quiet. Poets wrote about ladies whose voices were like music, always paired with submission and grace. Conversely, a woman with a sharp tongue or an assertive tone was compared to animals, witches, or demons. Her voice didn't just break social rules, it violated the very image of ideal femininity. The Church reinforced this ideal. Female saints and nuns were praised for their silence, their soft chanting, or their reluctance to speak in public. The more a woman's voice could mirror stillness, the more holy she appeared. Even in religious contexts, where women were allowed to sing or recite prayers, they were expected to do so in groups or behind veils, never drawing attention to themselves individually. This pressure extended to love and courtship as well. In courtly romance, the lady was often silent while the knight professed his devotion. She might respond with a glance or a gesture, but rarely with direct speech. Her quietness was seen as a sign of virtue, an invitation for worship rather than conversation. To speak openly of love or desire risked labeling her as immoral. Even in more mundane settings, women modulated their voices to avoid scrutiny. A loud laugh in the wrong place could invite scandal. A firm no might be interpreted as rudeness. Mothers taught daughters how to speak beautifully, which really meant how to sound small, gentle, and non-threatening. And yet, within this restrictive framework, some women found ways to wield their voices with power. Troubadour women in southern France composed songs that pushed boundaries. Wise women and healers used chants and prayers passed down through generations. In quiet moments behind closed doors, women sang lullabies, told stories, and passed on wisdom. Their voices may have been silenced in public, but they still carried strength in private. In the end, the ideal voice of a medieval woman was not really hers. It belonged to a system that defined beauty through absence of volume, absence of opinion, absence of power. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval beauty standards was how deeply they were tied to a woman's morality. A beautiful woman wasn't just admired, she was assumed to be good. Her looks were seen as proof of her purity, her worth, her faith. And by contrast, women who did not meet those ideals, those with darker skin, fuller bodies, marked faces, or aging features, were viewed with suspicion, even fear. This belief came from a mixture of religious doctrine and folk superstition. The idea was simple and devastating. Outer beauty reflected inner virtue. A woman with smooth skin, bright eyes, and delicate features was assumed to be closer to the divine. Her beauty was seen as a blessing from God, a reward for her chastity and piety. Conversely, a woman who looked rough or unruly must surely be flawed in spirit. She was blamed for her appearance, regardless of health, circumstance, or age. This logic empowered the patriarchy. If beauty meant goodness, then any woman who resisted the standard, by choice or necessity, could be dismissed, shamed, or punished. It wasn't just about fashion. Beauty became a kind of moral armor. Women had to look pure to be treated with respect. They had to appear controlled to be trusted. If their bodies didn't match the ideal, their character was called into question. Aging was especially cruel under this system. As women grew older, they inevitably lost the traits that medieval society prized: smooth skin, plump lips, shining hair. And as their beauty faded, so did their social value. A once beloved wife could become a source of ridicule. An aging woman who spoke her mind risked being branded a crone, a hag, or worse, a witch. Her wrinkles were read like a confession. Even noble women couldn't escape this trap. They used cosmetics to delay the visible signs of aging, but doing so risked accusations of vanity or witchcraft. It was a double bind: age naturally and be cast aside, fight it and be condemned for pride. The only way to win was to be eternally youthful, eternally silent, and eternally obedient, a fantasy no real woman could fulfill. And yet, through all of this, women endured. They created beauty in spite of judgment. They supported one another, passed down remedies, shared advice. In private, they laughed, aged, cried, and grew wise. But in public, they wore the armor. Because in a world that judged them at a glance, survival often meant looking the part, even if it hurt. In medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just a personal state, it was a public expectation and a prized feature of female beauty. A woman's value, especially among the noble and royal classes, was intimately tied to her purity, and the markers of that purity weren't just moral, they were physical. Pale skin, youthful softness, slender figures, and downcast eyes were all considered signs of virginity. To look like a virgin was to embody the most elevated and desirable form of femininity. Virginity was symbolized through both visual cues and behavioral codes. Brides were expected to appear innocent, not only in dress, often white or pastel with floral motifs, but in posture, voice, and even breath. A girl who was too confident, too loud, or too expressive could raise suspicions. Conversely, meekness, silence, and a lack of worldly knowledge were praised as proof of unspoiled virtue. A woman's very presence had to radiate chastity. This ideal was deeply entangled with the religious teachings of the time. The Virgin Mary wasn't just a holy figure, she was the standard. Artists portrayed her with luminous skin, delicate hands, and wide, solemn eyes. These visual traits trickled into secular culture, where beauty became a coded language for virginity. Women whose bodies or personalities strayed from this script were often overlooked, shamed, or worse. The burden of proving virginity fell entirely on women. Physical examinations were not uncommon, especially in cases involving royal marriages or accusations of immorality. In folklore and rumor, people even spoke of supernatural signs, blood on sheets, glowing auras, or the ability to control animals, as indicators of a woman's untouched state. Naturally, none of these were real, but belief in them shaped women's lives and decisions in frightening ways. And there was no redemption once virginity was lost, even in cases of abuse or coercion. A woman could be cast out, forced into a convent, or punished publicly. Her beauty, once praised, was now suspect. She had gone from being an object of admiration to an object of scorn. It didn't matter if she was kind, clever, or even still young. Without virginity, she was considered tarnished. Many women learned to perform virginity through appearance alone. They dressed modestly, painted their faces to look more childlike, and avoided direct eye contact with men. In essence, they crafted a visual lie to survive a culture that valued their chastity above their humanity. Virginity wasn't just a moral state, it was a visual brand, a dangerous ideal, and an impossible promise. And for medieval women, it defined not only their beauty, but their entire future. Ironically, for all the pressure medieval women faced to be beautiful, they were simultaneously taught to be ashamed of their beauty. To be too attractive was dangerous. It could provoke lust, inspire jealousy, or be seen as a tool of manipulation. And yet, to not be beautiful at all invited ridicule, exclusion, and social punishment. Women were trapped in a maddening contradiction, expected to be lovely, but never aware of it, seen, but not seen enjoying the attention. Church teachings reinforced this shame. Beauty was often described as a test or a temptation. Religious texts warned women not to take pride in their appearance, lest they fall into vanity or invite sinful thoughts in others. Some sermons blamed women's beauty for men's failures, claiming that a single glimpse of a well-dressed girl could send a man into sin. In this twisted logic, the woman bore responsibility not only for her own soul, but for every man who saw her. As a result, beautiful women often felt the need to hide or downplay their looks. Noble women veiled themselves in public, not just for modesty, but to avoid being accused of showing off. Cosmetics were applied discreetly, and perfumes used sparingly. Compliments were deflected, not accepted. Even portraits flattered their subjects without ever suggesting vanity. The beauty was always painted as God-given, not chosen. This shame also extended to how women were treated by other women. Jealousy could be deadly. In a society with limited opportunities for power, beauty became a source of competition. Women judged each other harshly for any hint of flirtation, adornment, or pride. A girl who stood out too much might find herself the target of rumors, shaming, or social isolation. And yet, beauty was a form of currency. It opened doors, forged alliances, and secured marriages. Families sometimes paraded daughters in front of visiting nobles or clergy, showing off their finest clothes and freshest faces. But if the daughter smiled too freely or showed too much enjoyment, she was chastised. The performance had to be careful, a silent dance between pride and piety, allure and innocence. This impossible balance left women constantly second-guessing themselves. Was that dress too bold? Was that glance too inviting? Should they refuse a compliment, or would that be seen as false humility? It was exhausting. Beauty became both a prize and a burden, a gilded cage that demanded perfection, but punished joy. In the end, medieval beauty wasn't just about appearance. It was about behavior, morality, and submission. And perhaps nothing illustrates this better than the fact that a woman could be adored for her beauty, yet shamed if she ever dared to enjoy it. In medieval beauty, the eyes held a special place. They were not merely features, they were considered portals to the soul. A woman's eyes were expected to convey modesty, submission, and virtue without saying a word. In literature and religious texts, a beautiful woman was often described by the gentleness of her gaze, the clarity of her eyes, or the way she looked downward, never too boldly, never too directly. Large, wide eyes were the most prized. They symbolized innocence, wonder, and moral purity. Soft brown or pale blue hues were admired, though more for what they represented than for any particular color. What mattered most was how a woman used her eyes. A modest woman lowered her gaze. She blinked slowly, never stared, and certainly didn't maintain eye contact with men. Direct eye contact was seen as flirtatious or aggressive, traits considered shameful or even sinful in women. In courtly romance, a lover might fall in love with a woman solely from a glance, yet that glance had to be accidental, fleeting, and pure. A gaze that lingered too long marked a woman as immodest. In religious contexts, saints were shown with eyes turned upward or inward, indicating divine focus and spiritual restraint. Women were encouraged to mirror this behavior, controlling even their line of sight to preserve their reputation. There were even guides for how to look properly. Some texts advised women to keep their eyelids slightly lowered in the presence of men, to flutter their lashes but never too quickly, and to avoid eye movements that could be misinterpreted as provocative. These unspoken rules made simply looking at someone a potential minefield of judgment. Cosmetically, eyes were left largely untouched by makeup. Enhancing them too obviously was frowned upon. Instead, women were advised to cleanse their eyes with herbal infusions like fennel or rosewater to keep them clear and bright. In some circles, women subtly darkened their lashes or eyelids with soot or charcoal, but this had to be done with extreme caution. Too much embellishment, and the effect shifted from beauty to vanity, a moral failing. The irony is that while women were expected to speak little and remain still, their eyes were constantly being watched and interpreted. A smile could be misread, but a glance, that was a confession. A moment of eye contact could ruin a reputation. Thus, the eyes became both a tool and a trap, a space where women were supposed to reflect beauty and virtue, but where they were also endlessly vulnerable to misinterpretation. While noble women bore the burden of performing beauty through artifice and control, the vast majority of medieval women, peasants, farmers, servants, were excluded from those expectations entirely. Their beauty was not publicly celebrated. In many cases, it was erased from the cultural record. And yet, in the fields, homes, and workshops of medieval Europe, laboring women carried their own forms of beauty, raw, functional, and deeply human. These women didn't have the luxury of delicate powders or perfumed oils. Their hands were rough from work, their skin darkened by sun and wind, their clothes practical and often patched. Yet within this world of physical hardship, there was a grace born of survival. The strong arms that ground grain or carried water had their own elegance. The lined faces that smiled after hours in the field told stories of strength. And the bodies that bore children, milked animals, scrubbed floors, and spun wool were beautiful, not because they matched some fragile ideal, but because they kept entire communities alive. Unfortunately, medieval art and literature rarely acknowledged this. Beauty was defined by distance, by the untouchable, the pale, the silent. The laboring woman was too present, too loud, too essential to be romanticized. At best, she was ignored. At worst, she was depicted as coarse or undesirable. The church reinforced this by tying physical cleanliness and beauty to spiritual purity, leaving women who worked outdoors spiritually suspect. But within their own circles, these women passed on traditions of care and pride. They braided one another's hair in the mornings, shared herbal remedies for cracked skin, swapped old scarves for special days, and took joy in moments of rest. In the brief pauses between chores, they found ways to feel whole. Their beauty rituals were not about appearance, they were about dignity and connection. And while noble women performed femininity for courts and suitors, laboring women performed it for each other, for their children, and for themselves. Theirs was a beauty of resilience, not sculpted in marble or painted in manuscripts, but etched into calloused fingers and sun-warmed shoulders. History may have ignored their faces, but it was built on their backs. While modern makeup might enhance beauty or express personality, in medieval Europe, cosmetics were often a gamble with death. The pressure to achieve the ideal face, pale, smooth, ageless, pushed women to use substances that were not only uncomfortable, but in many cases, lethal. From lead-based powders to mercury-infused creams, medieval beauty potions were less like skincare and more like slow-acting poisons, dressed in glass vials and gilded jars. The most sought-after look was pallor, a snow-white face that suggested nobility, leisure, and purity. To achieve it, women applied white powders made from substances like lead carbonate or chalk. Lead-based cosmetics clung to the skin, covered blemishes, and created a smooth, ghostly complexion. But they also seeped into the pores, entering the bloodstream and causing headaches, nausea, hair loss, and eventually, organ failure. Over time, the very makeup meant to perfect the face would discolor it, age it, and destroy it. Rouge was another staple. A faint flush on the cheeks signified youth and liveliness, so women used crushed berries, red ochre, or more dangerously, cinnabar, a bright red mineral that contained toxic mercury. Mercury exposure brought tremors, mental confusion, and damage to internal organs. Some women even used vinegar mixed with lead to remove spots or scars, creating chemical burns that only made things worse. Yet the danger didn't deter them. Noble women had little else to fall back on if they began aging early or suffered from skin conditions. Beauty was tied to power and marriage. And in a world where their futures depended on appearances, many women considered the risks worth it. Beauty manuals, often handwritten and passed between aristocratic households, offered recipes that sound horrifying today: mixtures of animal fat, ashes, powdered bone, and caustic lime. These guides also gave instructions on how to apply them subtly, so as not to appear vain or artificial, since public knowledge of cosmetic use could damage a woman's reputation. It was a cruel paradox. Women were expected to be beautiful naturally, and punished if their efforts to meet that demand became visible. The church also condemned makeup, especially when it altered God's intended face. Preachers accused women who used cosmetics of practicing deception or inviting lust. In some sermons, makeup was equated with witchcraft, but the warnings did little to stem the trend, especially among court circles where appearances ruled everything. Even when cosmetics began to visibly harm women, causing sores, peeling skin, even death, they continued to use them, because to age was to disappear, to be blemished was to be judged. And to be judged, in the Middle Ages, could mean exile from love, power, or safety. If something went wrong in medieval society, crops failed, illness spread, or tempers flared, women's beauty could become an easy scapegoat. Women were accused of sorcery or seduction, blamed for leading men astray, or even punished simply for attracting the wrong kind of attention. The prettier the woman, the greater the danger she supposedly posed. This wasn't just paranoia, it was cultural structure. In both religious and secular thought, a beautiful woman was often cast as a temptress. She might be likened to Eve, blamed for Adam's fall. Or she could be compared to biblical harlots, seen as sent by the devil to test men's piety. Beauty was not innocent, it was weaponized by society, feared for the power it gave women in a world where power was supposed to be male. Men who were caught sinning could deflect guilt by blaming the beauty of the woman involved. Poets wrote verses about how he couldn't help himself, that the lady's eyes or skin or smile were bewitching. In law, this thinking sometimes shaped real punishments. A woman who caused lustful thoughts could be reprimanded for immodest dress, even if she wore what was expected. If a man acted inappropriately, her appearance might be considered part of the provocation. This pattern of blame extended to accusations of witchcraft. Women who aged but retained beauty were seen as suspicious. Surely they must have struck a deal with dark forces to preserve their looks. Widows who dressed well were gossiped about. Midwives who used herbal knowledge for skin care or healing might be labeled witches, especially if they were too confident or too admired. In this way, beauty became a risk factor. The more attractive a woman was, the more vulnerable she became to scrutiny, gossip, and danger. And yet, women could not escape the expectation to be beautiful. If they let themselves go, they were shamed. If they tried too hard, they were suspected. If they were beautiful without effort, they were envied and feared. And when society needed someone to punish, to humiliate, or to make an example of, beautiful women made convenient targets. They stood out, they provoked feeling. And in a culture that feared female power, even the power of appearance was seen as too much. So, beauty became not only a standard to reach, but a reason to suffer. In the Middle Ages, a woman's hair was more than just a part of her appearance. It was a moral statement, a symbol of virtue, sexuality, status, and even danger. Long, flowing hair was considered one of the most seductive features a woman could possess, which is why it had to be hidden, controlled, or ritually altered. Hair wasn't just about style. It was about discipline. For unmarried women, especially of noble birth, hair was often worn loose, but only in specific ceremonial contexts, most notably on the wedding day, when unbound hair symbolized virginity and openness to marriage. At all other times, girls and women were expected to braid, bind, or veil their hair. Letting it flow freely in daily life was considered scandalous, a sign of wildness or lewd behavior. The church especially emphasized modesty when it came to hair. Sermons compared uncovered hair to temptation itself, warning that a man might fall into sin just by seeing it. For married women, veiling the hair became not just a religious expectation but a cultural rule. Veils, wimples, and elaborate headpieces were used to signal both marital status and piety. In many towns, it was considered indecent for a wife to show her hair in public, much like baring her legs or chest. And in some regions, the law even enforced this modesty. Women caught with uncovered hair could be fined or publicly shamed. Even the way hair was groomed spoke volumes. Smooth, light-colored hair was praised in courtly literature, often described as golden or like threads of sunlight. Dark, coarse, or curly hair, by contrast, was sometimes associated with foreignness, witchcraft, or low birth. As a result, some women lightened their hair with lye, vinegar, or sun bleaching, which often caused damage or breakage. Hairstyles were chosen carefully not for comfort, but to match ideals passed down through stories, religion, and social pressure. And the stakes could be terrifyingly high. In times of conflict, women accused of adultery or rebellion might be punished by having their hair cut off, a symbolic stripping of dignity, beauty, and power. Shorn hair marked shame, submission, and defeat. It was a public humiliation meant to reduce a woman's status in the eyes of everyone who saw her. Despite this, Women often took pride in their hair privately. In quiet spaces with other women, they brushed, styled, and adorned one another's heads. Hair became a rare outlet for creativity and expression, even if it had to be hidden from public view. It was one of the few parts of themselves they could claim, at least for a little while. In the medieval world, the female body was something to be cloaked, managed, and spoken about in whispers. Every part of a woman, ankles, arms, shoulders, and waist, was subject to scrutiny, not for its beauty alone, but for what it supposedly revealed about her inner self. Curves suggested fertility, thinness suggested discipline, and any deviation from what was considered ideal could result in moral condemnation, but almost none of it was visible in public. The art of medieval beauty was the art of concealment. Women's clothing was designed not to accentuate, but to control. Layers of linen, wool, and occasionally silk wrapped the body in modesty, concealing both shape and skin. Tight corset-like garments were not common in early medieval fashion, but began to appear later, and when they did, they served to mold the body into the favored silhouette, slim, long-waisted, and graceful. The goal was not to draw attention, but to create a body that appeared restrained and refined. Anything too shapely or exposed was seen as sinful. Despite these restrictions, the body was still a subject of obsession. Poets described ideal forms in impossibly delicate terms: slender waists, swan-like necks, narrow shoulders, and small, high breasts. These descriptions were fantasy more than reality, but they seeped into the cultural imagination. Artists painted women with near-identical proportions, reinforcing narrow ideals that real women were expected to measure themselves against, even if only privately. For many women, these pressures created a sense of alienation from their own physical selves. Their bodies weren't their own. They were measured, interpreted, and judged from the outside. A protruding belly might be seen as gluttony. Visible ankles could be called provocative. A flushed face, even from work or illness, might be mistaken for desire or shame. To exist in a female body meant constantly adjusting how it was presented to others. Yet women still found ways to reclaim their physicality. In the privacy of a bathhouse, among female friends or family, they relaxed, laughed, even admired one another without fear. In pregnancy and childbirth, they experienced the raw power of the body in ways men could never understand. And though society tried to dictate how they moved, stood, or even breathed, women's bodies carried their strength, their memory, and their defiance. The beauty of the body wasn't always visible, but it was always there, beneath the fabric, beneath the rules. In medieval society, beauty wasn't shaped only by fashion or poetry, it was profoundly sculpted by religion. The church didn't merely guide people's spiritual lives, it defined their values, aspirations, and even their physical ideals. A beautiful woman wasn't just attractive, she was seen as a reflection of divine order, a symbol of moral balance, or, paradoxically, a warning against earthly temptation. This complex religious lens shaped how women dressed, moved, and even understood their own faces. Religious texts praised modesty above all else. Women were taught that inner purity mattered more than outer beauty, yet outward appearance was expected to reflect that purity. A woman who looked too proud, too bold, or too vain was assumed to be spiritually corrupt. A devout woman, by contrast, kept her eyes lowered, her clothing simple, her skin unadorned, and her body hidden. The idea was that physical restraint mirrored spiritual obedience. Art reinforced this standard. Saints were portrayed as luminous, serene, and untouched by worldly vanity. Mary, the most venerated female figure in Christianity, became the ultimate model, not for her physical perfection, but for her humility and grace. Still, her image was almost always beautiful. Soft features, downcast eyes, smooth hands, these visual cues became the markers of sanctity and, by extension, feminine perfection. Women who didn't meet those cues, even through no fault of their own, were viewed with suspicion. Clothing became a way to express religious devotion. Nuns wore habits that erased individual identity, reducing the body to near invisibility. Lay women who wanted to signal piety might mimic these looks through long veils, plain dresses, or minimal adornment. In some cases, even wealthy noble women gave up their jewels and finery as acts of penitence, choosing instead to embrace simplicity in the hope that it might cleanse their souls. But this fusion of beauty and faith could be cruel. Women who suffered from illness, disfigurement, or aging were often assumed to be spiritually lacking, as if their outer appearance reflected some hidden sin. Likewise, women who were too beautiful were accused of inviting lust and distraction, even if they tried to hide it. Religious leaders preached about the dangers of female beauty, warning men to look away and women to cover up. Yet they continued to praise saints for their heavenly appearance, creating an impossible double standard. For medieval women, faith dictated not only how they lived, but how they looked and how they were looked at. The medieval obsession with youth was relentless. While wisdom was occasionally praised, especially in men, beauty in women was tied almost entirely to how young they appeared. Smooth skin, unlined faces, and round features were worshipped. The moment a woman began to show signs of aging, society treated her as though her usefulness and her desirability were slipping away. This wasn't just about aesthetics. In a time when a woman's value was often defined by her ability to marry well and bear children, youth became economic and social capital. A girl of 12 or 13 might already be considered marriageable, especially among the nobility. By her mid-20s, she might be seen as past her prime. The physical signs of aging, gray hair, crow's feet, looser skin, were treated almost like moral failings. Women were judged not only for how they looked, but for the fact that they dared to age at all. Skincare was a desperate attempt to hold time at bay. Women rubbed their faces with honey, eggs, herbs, and even animal fats to soften skin and hide wrinkles. Some resorted to harsher treatments, like applying hot cloths or acidic juices. Any signs of maturity had to be masked, at least for as long as possible. Art and literature reinforced this obsession. The ideal woman was forever youthful, slender, wide-eyed, her body untouched by childbirth or time. Even the Madonna was often depicted with teenage features, regardless of her age in the story. Meanwhile, older women in tales were usually witches, nags, or comic relief. If a woman in a story was wise, she was rarely beautiful. If she was beautiful, she was young. These two traits were rarely allowed to coexist. Aging women found themselves socially invisible. No longer considered marriageable, they were often set aside, pushed into religious life, hidden in back rooms, or kept as domestic caretakers. Their stories were not told. Their faces disappeared from paintings. Their advice went unheeded. Yet these women were often the backbone of their families and communities. They carried the knowledge of midwifery, herbal medicine, household management, and survival. They taught, guided, healed. But because they no longer met society's visual standard of beauty, they were no longer seen. In medieval life, youth wasn't just fleeting, it was everything. And once it faded, the world stopped looking. In a world where direct expression was discouraged, especially for women, beauty often had to speak in whispers, through fabric, color, gesture, and form. Veils, head coverings, and subtle fashion details became a language of their own. Women couldn't say what they wanted openly, but they could hint. They could signal status, desire, availability, and even rebellion through how they wore what little they were allowed to reveal. The veil was one of the most powerful tools in this silent vocabulary. While it was associated with modesty and religious devotion, it was also deeply symbolic. The way a woman wore her veil, its length, transparency, and layering, could indicate whether she was married, widowed, noble, or devout. A glimpse of hair beneath the edge might be deliberate, especially in courtly environments where flirtation had to be subtle. Lifting a veil slightly while sipping wine or bowing one's head could become an elegant display of allure wrapped in innocence. Colors, too, carried meaning. Deep blues suggested loyalty or chastity, while reds hinted at fertility or passion. Wealthier women had access to richer dyes and finer fabrics, silks, velvets, brocades, which allowed them to layer status over beauty. Even when garments were modest in cut, their texture and pattern whispered volumes. Gold-threaded hems, jeweled fasteners, or fur-lined cuffs could dazzle without revealing a single inch of skin. But this language was dangerous too. A woman who wore too much color could be accused of vanity. One who wore too little might be called cold or unapproachable. As with everything in medieval beauty, the challenge was to walk the narrow path between being noticed and being condemned. Courtly love, that elaborate dance of chaste flirtation among nobles, relied heavily on these unspoken signals. Women could not pursue openly, but they could tilt their head just so, wear a flower in their sleeve, or drop a glove at the right moment. Poems and songs hinted at these gestures, encoding them in metaphors of roses, birds, and stars. To the untrained eye, they were just accessories. To those in the know, they were declarations. Even within marriages, veils could hold meaning. A wife might veil more heavily in times of mourning or use lighter fabrics during celebrations. Some women began to reinterpret modesty itself as a form of control, not hiding because they had to, but because it gave them power over what others saw and desired. Mystery became its own form of beauty. In a culture where women were watched but rarely heard, veils and garments became their voice. To the modern eye, beauty rituals might seem like self-expression, indulgence, or even fun. But for many medieval women, beauty wasn't joyful, it was agony. The effort required to meet the standards of the time could be painful, exhausting, and even physically damaging. What seemed glamorous from a distance was, up close, a test of endurance. Take the iconic high foreheads, for example. Women plucked their hairlines to achieve this ideal, pulling out rows of hair from their temples and the tops of their brows to create the illusion of a long, noble face. It wasn't done with gentle tweezers, but often with sharp blades or even burning cloths. The process caused swelling, scabbing, and permanent follicle damage. But it was praised as elegant, so they endured it. Corseting may not have reached its most punishing form until later centuries, but tight lacing and bodice shaping still existed. Layers of cloth wound around the torso to create a narrow waist, especially for public appearances. Breath was sacrificed for form. Comfort was always second to appearance. Many women fainted from overheating at summer feasts or struggled to breathe during long religious services, all in the name of appearing graceful. Shoes, too, played their part in this quiet torment. Pointed toe slippers, popular among the wealthy, distorted natural foot shape over time. They were made of thin fabric, offering little protection from cold or mud, but they marked status, and so they were worn. Even jewelry could hurt. Heavy earrings stretched earlobes, tight collars chafed the skin, metal combs caused headaches, perfumed oils triggered rashes. But adornment was not optional, it was a marker of belonging. A well-adorned woman was seen as valuable, desirable, and respectable. One who neglected beauty was dismissed as unworthy or suspicious. All of this had to be done without complaint. The goal was to appear effortlessly beautiful, serene, composed, untouched by the struggle it took to get there. The work happened in private, behind closed doors. The pain was hidden behind smiles. Yet even in that pain, there was pride. To endure the rituals meant you were strong enough, disciplined enough, devoted enough to earn your place. In a world that measured women by how they looked, the agony of adornment became a quiet form of survival. In medieval Europe, a woman's voice was not part of the beauty ideal. It was often seen as something to be managed, muted, or ignored altogether. silence was praised as the ultimate feminine virtue. To speak too often, too freely, or too confidently was to risk being labeled proud, lascivious, or unruly. And so, silence became part of the performance of beauty. Women were expected not just to look a certain way, but to sound a certain way, or, more often, not at all. Courtly texts, religious sermons, and conduct guides repeated this idea constantly. The most beautiful woman was the one who said little. Her words were rare and gentle, her tone soft, her laughter restrained. A quiet woman was assumed to be wise, patient, and virtuous. A talkative one, especially if she showed wit or sarcasm, could be branded immoral. Beauty, therefore, wasn't simply visual, it was behavioral. Sound, or the absence of it, shaped a woman's desirability. In noble courts, women learned to speak through coded glances, sighs, and gestures. Poetry allowed them to communicate without seeming forward. In private letters, they poured out feelings they couldn't voice aloud, but in public, they had to preserve the illusion of passivity. Even their singing, which was celebrated in certain contexts, had to remain within acceptable emotional bounds, pure, delicate, melancholic. Anything too bold could be viewed as a challenge to male authority. This expectation of silence wasn't just social, it had consequences. In legal matters, women's testimony was often considered less reliable than men's. In accusations of adultery, abuse, or inheritance disputes, a woman who spoke too much or too passionately could be dismissed or punished. Speaking in defense of one's beauty or against an injustice was seen as immodest. Silence even extended to suffering. If a woman experienced pain from childbirth, illness, or the harmful effects of beauty rituals, she was expected to bear it quietly. Enduring discomfort without complaint was seen as noble, graceful. A beautiful woman was not supposed to groan or grimace. She was to smile, to whisper, to fade into the background like a pleasant dream. Yet within that enforced silence, some women found subtle ways to speak. They wrote poetry under pen names, offered advice to younger women through lullabies and prayers, and passed down resistance through stories told at the hearth. Silence was the rule, but not always the truth. Beauty, in the medieval mind, was as much about restraint as radiance, and a woman's silence, chosen or imposed, became one of her most defining and misunderstood features. In the end, even death did not release medieval women from the burdens of beauty. The ideal of the beautiful death, peaceful, composed, unblemished, was a haunting reflection of the values they carried in life. Women were expected to die gracefully, just as they had lived gracefully. Even in their final moments, appearance mattered. This idea wasn't just poetic, it shaped how people treated dying women. A deathbed was often staged as a scene of spiritual serenity. The dying woman was washed, dressed, and arranged to look gentle and pure. Her hair was brushed, her hands folded. If she had time to prepare, she was expected to confess, forgive, and let go of earthly concerns without fear or tears. Anything less than a tranquil passing could be interpreted as spiritual weakness, or worse, as evidence of sin. In noble families, women's corpses were displayed briefly for mourning, adorned in their finest garments. The dead body was treated as a symbol of both virtue and legacy. A serene face suggested a righteous soul. An anguished expression might raise uneasy questions. Pain had to be erased, softened into eternal grace. Death art, too, reflected these expectations. Women in tomb effigies were shown youthful, elegant, unmarked by illness or childbirth. Their hands were often clasped in prayer, their faces idealized beyond recognition. Even after decades of suffering, their final image had to match the ideal they had chased in life. For women who died young, especially in childbirth, their passing was often romanticized. Songs and poems lamented their beauty, fading too soon, treating death as the ultimate preservation of innocence. Their loss was not just personal but symbolic, reinforcing cultural values about purity, motherhood, and sacrifice. A beautiful dead woman became a saint-like figure, stripped of her voice and struggle, frozen forever in idealized stillness. But behind this iconography was real suffering, disease, malnutrition, infected wounds, complications from birth or abuse. Most women did not die in quiet beauty. They died in pain, surrounded by fear, rarely in control of their fate. Yet history often refused to record those truths. It chose the illusion instead, the woman as a graceful statue, the silence of her corpse mistaken for peace. To be beautiful, even in death, was to be reduced to an image, and for medieval women, that image was never really theirs to shape. The Middle Ages were full of myths, fairy tales, legends, and religious parables that idealized certain types of women. These stories didn't just entertain, they taught women how to behave, how to look, and what to aspire to. But behind the flowery language and noble themes were impossible standards, standards that twisted beauty into something mythic and unreachable. In many of these tales, the ideal woman was passive and perfect. She was described as having skin like milk, hair like gold, lips like roses, and a voice as soft as bells. She never spoke out of turn. She rarely moved without grace. She endured suffering with a saint's patience and smiled through pain. Her beauty was effortless, divine, untouched by the realities of dirt, illness, or age. And yet, that same beauty always came at a cost. It led men to war, stirred jealousy, or sealed her tragic fate. Legends like those of Guinevere, Isolde, or the Virgin Mary weren't just romantic stories. They were deeply embedded blueprints for how women were expected to look and act. Young girls heard them from childhood, learning that love, redemption, and even salvation depended on fitting these molds. If you weren't born with those traits, you were expected to chase them, and if you failed, you were made to feel like a flaw in the story. These myths didn't just affect noble women. They trickled down through songs, prayers, and public festivals. Women of all classes absorbed the same ideals. A milkmaid might be praised for looking like a queen, not because she had power, but because she matched the fairy tale image of beauty. Meanwhile, women who didn't fit, those with scars, dark skin, loud voices, or strong opinions, were cast as villains, witches, or fools in the same tales. Even when women tried to use these myths to their advantage, dressing like queens, acting demure, pretending to be fragile, the outcome rarely favored them. The myth could only hold one ideal woman at a time. Everyone else was just a shadow, a warning, or a rival. And so, generation after generation of women measured themselves against a lie. A beautiful lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless, because the legends never told the whole story. They never showed the hours spent plucking hairlines, the bruises hidden under gowns, or the silent tears shed in dark corners. The medieval ideal woman wasn't real. She was a dream written by men, sculpted into stone, sung into song, but never allowed to speak for herself. Centuries have passed since the Middle Ages, but their beauty ideals haven't vanished. They've changed shapes, shifted forms, and dressed themselves in modern language, but they're still here, whispering in magazines, flashing through screens, and settling into our subconscious. The pale skin, the smooth faces, the long hair, the silence, it's all still with us, disguised as timeless elegance or natural femininity. The medieval world taught women that beauty was the foundation of their worth. It measured them in glances and judged them in silences. And though we now have more freedom, more voices, more choices, the echoes remain. Today's women still face the pressure to be young forever, flawless without effort, desirable but never trying too hard. The tools have changed, but the expectations are familiar. Lipstick replaces lead. Photoshop replaces paintings, but the cost of chasing perfection still weighs heavy. We've inherited the myth of effortless beauty, the shame of aging, the suspicion of ambition, and the glorification of silence. These legacies didn't disappear with the Middle Ages, they evolved, survived, and rebranded. And the more we understand where they came from, the more we can begin to question them. Because the truth is, medieval women weren't just victims of a cruel beauty system, they were survivors. They resisted in small ways, through stories, rituals, sisterhood, and simple acts of self-preservation. They found meaning where they could. They passed down more than just ideals, they passed down resilience. So when we look at beauty today, with its filters, edits, and endless pressures, we're not starting from scratch, we're standing on centuries of struggle. And every time a woman chooses to love her face as it is, speak when she's told to be quiet, or define her own worth, she breaks the chain a little more. Medieval beauty was never just about appearances, it was about power, and reclaiming it starts with seeing the truth behind the illusion.